Yeah, so that was the last fight of my deal. I told you last time we spoke after the fight that I wanted to test free agency, test the water, see whatever. I know what I think I'm worth. I know what I am worth.
So right now, the UFC is genuinely cracking under pressure, and we're watching fighters walk away for significantly better pay while Dana White tries to maintain control of a situation that's rapidly slipping through his fingers. What looked like this untouchable powerhouse of elite fighters is suddenly losing its grip, and there was one specific moment that exposed the entire system. Absolutely shocking stuff. I've got all the details here, so let's dive straight into it. UFC fighters are leaving, and this is massive. I'm gonna start with the truth. The UFC desperately never wanted you to hear, because burying the lead here would be doing a disservice to what's actually happening behind closed doors. The UFC, this so-called untouchable giant of combat sports, is hemorrhaging fighters. Not by accident, not by coincidence, but because their own system is finally collapsing under the crushing weight of an outdated pay structure that hasn't evolved in decades. And here's the thing. The moment that exposed all of this didn't happen in some dramatic courtroom reveal or through a leaked email scandal. It happened in a quiet studio during a simple, straightforward sit-down interview when a fighter the UFC absolutely never expected to lose walked in, sat down calmly, and revealed that he was leaving the company because he'd finally discovered something genuinely better. What he shared wasn't just surprising, it was downright humiliating for the UFC, because for the first time, a fighter didn't say he wanted to leave out of anger or frustration. He said he had to leave, out of necessity. And when you hear the actual reason in his own words, you start to understand why insiders are quietly whispering that this is the pivotal moment where the UFC is no longer the only throne in the kingdom, and Dana White is no longer the one holding the crown. It all begins with Shane Burgos stepping into that studio, smiling, completely composed, and carrying the kind of secret that could legitimately shift the entire balance of fighter pay in MMA forever. And then he delivers the blow that sent absolute panic rippling through UFC headquarters. You can actually hear it in the clip itself, that exact moment when his decision becomes impossible for anyone to ignore.
When all is said and done after the first season, when I plan on winning, I'll be a multimillionaire.
And then, with absolutely zero hesitation, he drops the bombshell that changes everything. And besides, you announced that I'm signing with PFL. That single moment wasn't just some routine signing announcement for a new promotion. It was a full-blown statement to the entire combat sports world. It told everyone watching that a fighter the UFC had carefully built up, promoted extensively, and relied on heavily, was now walking away because someone else, someone completely outside the UFC's so-called untouchable kingdom, valued him significantly more than they did. It struck directly at the UFC's massive ego, and if you listen closely to what comes next in the conversation, you start to realize why this wasn't just about a fighter changing promotions. This was about a fighter publicly exposing the UFC's actual financial limits to the entire world. Because when Shane is asked point-blank whether the UFC even tried to match the PFL's offer, his answer slices right through the carefully constructed myth that the UFC can outbid anyone whenever they choose to. They couldn't. It was that good of a deal. Those words are absolutely devastating precisely because they're so brutally simple and honest. Not, they wouldn't match it. Not, they didn't want to match it. They couldn't match it. For a company that constantly brags about being the largest, most powerful MMA organization on the entire planet, being outbid this aggressively throws a massive spotlight on a truth that fans have suspected but could never quite prove. The UFC pays far, far less than their fighters are truly worth in the marketplace. And deep down, they absolutely know it. And what made this particular moment even more powerful and painful for the UFC is that Shane wasn't leaving out of anger or resentment. He wasn't publicly slamming the organization or burning bridges behind him. In fact, he practically went out of his way to speak respectfully about his time there, which only makes this entire story more painful for the UFC to swallow. Because when a fighter leaves emotionally and bitterly, it's relatively easy for the company to spin it publicly as just bitterness or a bad attitude. But Shane left with genuine gratitude. He thanked them sincerely, praised them honestly, appreciated the platform they gave him, and then still had to walk away for the sake of his family's future. It's one thing when some disgruntled, angry fighter leaves and burns everything down on the way out. It's something completely different when a loyal soldier realizes that loyalty alone doesn't pay the bills or secure his children's future. And Shane doesn't stop there with the revelation. When he's directly asked whether this PFL deal represents the biggest money of his entire fighting career, he doesn't even hesitate for a second. Not even close. Those three simple words summarize absolutely everything that's wrong with the UFC's pay model in one devastating phrase. Think about it. A fighter with 11 UFC fights under his belt, 11 high-impact, high-damage, incredibly entertaining performances that fans loved, had to leave the entire organization just to make what he calls real money for the first time. That's not just an isolated case or an outlier. That's a symptom of a much larger, much deeper systemic issue that the UFC keeps desperately trying to patch over with performance bonuses and promotional hype. But nothing exposes the massive financial gap more clearly than this next statement, when Shane talks about what the PFL deal truly means for his actual life. It's something you will genuinely never hear a mid-tier UFC fighter say about their contract.
I'm also pay fighters more, you know? And I know Dana's running a business, and he's a great businessman, so can he give out the checks that we want as fighters? That's like a business decision, you know? I obviously have always advocated throughout my career, now that I'm retired even more money for the fighters, because it's a tough job.
After just one season with the PFL, Shane could become a legitimate multimillionaire. Just one season. Think carefully about the message that sends, not to Dana White personally, not to the executives in their offices, but to every single fighter currently sitting on a UFC contract, wondering whether they're wasting the absolute prime years of their life on a pay scale that hasn't meaningfully evolved in over 20 years. When a talented fighter can earn generational wealth in the PFL faster than they can even earn basic financial security in the UFC, suddenly the whole UFC is the dream. Narrative starts to sound way less like reality, and way more like a carefully crafted sales pitch designed to keep fighters compliant. And yet, even after revealing all of that, Shane still remained completely respectful throughout the entire interview. He didn't bury the UFC publicly, he didn't call them cheap or greedy, he didn't make wild accusations or burn bridges. Instead, he spoke with genuine, heartfelt gratitude for the platform they provided him. And that's exactly why his departure actually hurts the UFC far more than any angry public rant or bitter exit ever could. It's that polite, respectful, heartfelt breakup that somehow stings the absolute deep. It's the ultimate, it's not you, it's the money moment, because it forces the UFC to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth they've been avoiding. Their fighters are no longer afraid to walk away, no longer afraid to test free agency and see their actual market value, and no longer convinced that the UFC is the only viable path to real success in this sport. And that reality is the very thing Dana White has spent literally 2 decades trying desperately to do from happening. Shane's calm, measured, respectful exit created this massive ripple effect throughout the entire MMA world, because it completely undermined the UFC's favorite defense mechanism, which has always been the idea that fighters who leave are simply unhappy, ungrateful, or washed up. But here was a fighter in his absolute competitive prime who genuinely loved the company, loved the platform, loved the fans, and still felt financially cornered into leaving. That fact alone should have triggered every possible alarm bell in the UFC's executive office. Fighters aren't supposed to realize their actual worth in the marketplace. Fighters aren't supposed to compare options across different organizations. Fighters aren't supposed to walk away from the so-called top promotion in the entire world simply because another organization respects their financial worth more. Yet that is exactly what happened right in front of everyone. And the message it sends is so much bigger than any single contract negotiation. It tells the entire UFC roster that loyalty to the company may earn you appreciation and respect, but it will absolutely never guarantee your family's financial future. And that's precisely why Dana White's reaction behind the scenes mattered so incredibly much. Dana has always operated under the core belief that the UFC is the pinnacle, the ultimate goal, the dream destination, the only place that truly matters in MMA. For years, he casually dismissed the idea of fighters going anywhere else as completely unrealistic. Where are they going to go was his favorite dismissive line whenever this topic came up. The UFC strategically positioned itself as the major leagues, and everything else was just amateur hour that didn't matter. But the PFL signing a fighter like Shane Burgos, not at the tail end of his career, not washed up and desperate but in his absolute competitive prime and ready to deliver world-class performances, directly contradicts that entire narrative. It proves definitively that somewhere else now genuinely exists in MMA, that somewhere else can actually pay significantly better, and that somewhere else is rapidly becoming attractive to fighters who, under completely normal circumstances, would never even consider leaving the UFC. What makes this entire shift even more powerful and damaging is Shane's raw honesty about how genuinely painful this decision was. For him personally, it wasn't some triumphant escape story or a rebellious walkout moment. It was a heavy, emotionally loaded choice that he struggled with for days before finally making. And that part exposes the UFC the most, because here's someone who genuinely loved the company, loved everything about it, and still couldn't rationally justify staying because the money simply didn't make sense anymore for his family. You can hear the weight in his voice in this specific part of the clip, when he reveals how torn he actually was about the whole thing. This isn't a fighter running away from the UFC out of anger. This is a fighter literally outgrowing it financially. And that's precisely what makes Dana White so uneasy about this situation. When fighters leave because they're angry or emotional, Dana can easily dismiss them as irrational or ungrateful. When fighters leave because they simply can't win fights anymore, he can frame it as a talent issue that resolved itself. But when fighters leave specifically because another organization is willing to pay them what they actually deserve, it fundamentally challenges the entire foundation the UFC has been built upon for decades. The core belief that fighters need the UFC far more than the UFC needs any individual fighter. Shane's departure represents the very first major crack in that foundation. Not because he's the biggest superstar the UFC ever had, but because he's exactly the kind of fighter the UFC relies on the most for its business model. Exciting, loyal, durable, a guaranteed action fighter who delivers every single time. These are the exact athletes the UFC strategically uses to build cards around bigger names, support rising stars, fill fight night main events, and keep fans genuinely engaged week after week. And now that specific type of fighter is realizing he can build a significantly better financial future outside the UFC's control. If one Shane Burgos realizes this truth, 2 more will seriously consider it. If 2 consider it, 10 will start thinking about it. And once 10 fighters realize they have legitimate, viable financial alternatives outside the UFC, Dana White's iron grip on power starts to fade rapidly. But here's the most dangerous part for the UFC's long-term future. It isn't just that one fighter left. It's that Shane openly stated, on camera, that the PFL could make him a legitimate multimillionaire faster than the UFC ever did, or ever would. That single fact alone functions as a powerful recruitment commercial for the PFL, whether Shane intended it that way or not. Fighters talk to each other constantly, gyms talk, managers talk, and when they hear that a mid-tier UFC contender could become a multimillionaire in a single PFL season, they immediately start doing the math on their own situations. Many of these fighters have been taking serious damage for years without even breaking 6 figures per fight in the UFC, and now they're hearing directly that the path to real financial stability and generational wealth might actually exist outside the UFC's walls. Shane's brutal honesty spreads faster than any promotional slogan ever could, because it comes from a place of genuine, lived experience. He isn't selling anything or marketing the PFL, he's simply explaining transparently why he chose financial security over emotional attachment and brand loyalty. And it's absolutely impossible to dismiss the emotional weight behind his decision when he talks about his daughters and his family. The UFC can argue about fighter pay structures all they want in boardrooms and press conferences, but they cannot argue with a father openly explaining that he made this difficult decision so he could look his children in the eyes and know he gave them the life they genuinely deserved. That's not a negotiation tactic or leverage play, that's not a publicity stunt or marketing move, that's raw reality, and that reality is now completely public for everyone to see. The UFC has always relied heavily on maintaining tight control over the narrative around fighter pay. Who deserves what, who's worth what, who earns enough, who complains too much, who should be grateful. But the moment Shane calmly stated on camera that the UFC couldn't match the PFL's offer, and then admitted that the PFL deal would legitimately turn him into a multimillionaire, the UFC lost control of that story completely. They could no longer hide the deeply uncomfortable truth that their pay scale is no longer competitive with a promotion they once considered completely irrelevant. The fans can feel this shift happening. The fighters can feel this shift happening. And quietly, behind closed doors, even the UFC executives can feel this shift happening. The truth is brutally simple here. The UFC still has the biggest brand recognition, the biggest platform, and the biggest spotlight in MMA. But the fighters, the actual beating heart of this entire sport, are rapidly learning that fame and exposure mean absolutely nothing if your bank account still says you're completely replaceable. Shane Burgos was never a massive superstar or pay-per-view draw, but he was beloved by hardcore fans. he was respected by everyone in the industry, and he earned his place through blood, sweat, and unforgettable wars inside that cage. If even he felt financially trapped inside the UFC system despite all that, then countless other fighters are surely feeling that exact same pressure right now. And that's why this moment is so much bigger than just PFL versus UFC, bigger than one contract dispute, bigger than one individual fighter's decision. This moment represents a genuine turning point in MMA history. It's the first real, undeniable sign that the UFC's long-standing grip on this sport is weakening. Not because someone is trying to compete with them through marketing or hype, but because fighters are finally realizing they don't have to accept less than what they're actually worth. Shane didn't want to leave the UFC at all. That's what makes this entire story so powerful and painful. He had to leave out of financial necessity. And when fighters start making major career decisions out of pure necessity rather than emotion or ego, that's when entire systems begin to crack at their foundation. The aftermath of Shane Burgos's departure didn't stay contained within one interview studio or one news. It rippled outward rapidly through gyms, locker rooms, management offices, and private group chats, where fighters talk far more honestly than they ever do in front of cameras or media. You could feel the vibration almost immediately. If Shane could leave and thrive, why couldn't others follow that path? If he could test the open market and win big, what was actually stopping the rest of them from doing the same? And that is exactly where the UFC's real systemic problem began. Not with Shane himself as an individual, but with the massive psychological shift he triggered across the entire fighter roster. For years and years, the UFC relied heavily on silence and information control. Fighters weren't supposed to compare paychecks with each other. They weren't supposed to ask what others earned or share contract details. They weren't supposed to question why a sport built entirely on sacrifice, damage, and danger pays just a tiny fraction of what other major professional sports pay their athletes. The UFC perfected the art of distraction over the years with big dramatic walkouts, explosive promo packages, and performance bonuses that sounded generous in press conferences, but rarely fixed the underlying structural issue. But when Shane shared publicly how significantly the PFL valued him financially, it tore a massive hole in that carefully constructed illusion. Suddenly, the UFC's fighters began asking themselves a simple but powerful question they had avoided for far too long. What am I really worth in the open market? What followed was a quiet but absolutely unmistakable shift in tone among fighters still under UFC contract. Interviews that once sounded purely grateful began to sound cautious and measured. Press conferences that once praised the UFC's platform and opportunity began to include subtle but clear hints of financial frustration. Even fighters who had never spoken publicly about pay issues began openly acknowledging that free agency wasn't just a risk anymore. It was a legitimate option worth seriously considering. And the UFC, whether they admitted it publicly or not, felt the pressure of that fundamental change. One of the strongest signs of this shift came from fighters discussing the emotional and physical toll of staying loyal to a system that didn't reward them proportionally to their sacrifice. The message from Shane resonated more deeply than anyone initially expected, because it wasn't coming from the mouth of a disgruntled veteran at the end of his career. It was the testimony of a fighter still very much in the competitive prime of his life. And when he said openly, and without any bitterness or anger, that he genuinely loved the UFC, but had to leave for the sake of his future, fighters across the roster listened carefully. They understood the subtext immediately. Loyalty doesn't pay the bills when you're injured. Gratitude doesn't protect your family when your fighting years are over, and the damage catches up. What made the situation even more volatile for the UFC was the timing of all this. The UFC had already taken multiple hits to its public image regarding fighter compensation. There were ongoing questions about revenue splits between the company and athletes. There were lawsuits challenging the company's labor practices. And there were former champions publicly stating they left the UFC financially richer than they ever were inside it. But Shane's story wasn't tainted by personal conflict or drama. It wasn't fueled by rivalry, tension, or a damaged relationship with management. It was a clean, rational, almost painfully honest break. And that is exactly what made it so dangerous for the UFC's carefully controlled narrative. Meanwhile, the PFL continued positioning itself strategically in the marketplace. They didn't just sign Shane as another fighter on their roster. They treated him like a valuable investment worth promoting. They offered him a legitimate platform, real visibility, and financial security that spoke directly to the needs UFC fighters had been quietly whispering about for years in private. To the casual outside world, it may have looked like one organization simply taking advantage of another's misstep. But to fighters paying close attention, it looked like the emergence of something they never expected to see: real leverage. And leverage is something the UFC never ever wanted fighters to discover they had. You can see that tension reflected indirectly in the UFC's response, or notable lack of one. Dana White did eventually comment on Shane leaving, but his tone carried an unusual mix of respect and clear disappointment. There's a specific moment from a UFC post-fight press conference that fans still refer to when discussing this entire situation. Dana was asked directly about losing Shane Burgos to the PFL, and for the first time in a very long time, he didn't sound defiant or dismissive. He sounded genuinely frustrated, almost caught off guard by the whole thing. With that line, "We should have resigned him," is about as close as you will ever get to Dana White publicly admitting the UFC dropped the ball on something important. It was a rare acknowledgement that someone's significance slipped through their fingers. And more importantly, that the UFC wasn't adequately prepared for the possibility that mid-tier fighters could become too expensive to keep under their standard contract model. That admission echoed loudly through the entire MMA world, because if the UFC can accidentally lose a fighter as consistently entertaining and reliable as Shane Burgos, it creates the uncomfortable impression that no one on the roster is truly safe anymore. Not even the athletes who consistently delivered the kinds of fights fans rave about online, and once fighters genuinely feel replaceable despite their contributions, they naturally start checking the exit doors. They start paying serious attention to other promotions' prize money, sponsorship opportunities, and long-term career paths. Suddenly, the UFC logo on those gloves means less than the actual numbers on the contract they're signing. The bigger systemic issue for the UFC is that every single fighter deeply understands the inherent fragility of this career. One serious injury can end absolutely everything overnight. One bad knockout can permanently alter their lives and cognitive function. One freak training accident can completely shut down a future they worked decades to build from nothing. So when Shane explains with complete honesty that he had to choose financial security over emotional attachment to the UFC brand, fighters immediately see themselves in his decision. They see the version of their own life where they stay loyal to the company and end up with mounting medical bills instead of retirement savings. They see the version where their children grow up watching their father walk with a permanent limp, but without the financial cushion that might have made that sacrifice genuinely worth it. And that emotional truth cuts deeper than any debate about contracts or promotional structures ever could. Because beneath all the marketing hype, all the bright lights, all the championship belts, and all the bravado, every fighter knows one fundamental thing. The window to make real, life-changing money is incredibly brutally small. The UFC has benefited enormously from fighters ignoring that truth for years. But now, thanks to fighters like Shane openly discussing their financial realities in public, that narrow window comes into sharp focus. What Shane did wasn't just leave one promotion for another. He turned on the lights in a dark room. He exposed how many fighters have been competing in the dark for years, completely unaware of their true market value, controlled by the belief that the UFC was the absolute end-all be-all of MMA success. And when the lights suddenly come on, people start noticing all the cracks in the walls. They start noticing the parts of the system that don't make logical sense. They start noticing how much money the UFC generates versus how much money actually trickles down to the fighters creating that value. And once they see it clearly, they can't unsee it. This is precisely why Shane's departure has been described by many analysts as the opening bell of a completely new era in MMA economics. It wasn't dramatic in tone, but it was absolutely devastating in impact. It wasn't angry or bitter, but it was deeply revealing. It didn't burn bridges publicly, but it burned illusions privately. And the UFC, for all its massive power and prestige, cannot extinguish the simple truth he exposed to everyone. Fighters have legitimate options now, and some of those options pay significantly more. Much, much more. That understanding alone has created a level of uncertainty within the UFC that they have genuinely never had to face before in their history. It has forced fighters to seriously reevaluate their existing contracts. It has forced managers to completely rethink negotiation strategies. And it has forced fans to question whether the UFC's dominance is as absolute and permanent as it once seemed. But the real shockwave, the one that truly threatens the UFC's long-term control, comes from what happens next in this story. More fighters who followed Shane's lead tested their own markets, and discovered that the UFC might not actually be the best financial home after all. Shane Burgos wasn't the last crack in the dam, he was simply the first visible one. By the time Shane Burgos finished publicly explaining his decision, the UFC already sensed that something irreversible had begun. But what they didn't expect was how quickly the effect would spread through the roster, and how deeply it would cut into the core of what made their empire stable for so long. Because once that first fighter leaves, specifically for better pay, others naturally begin to re-examine their own situations with fresh eyes. And once enough fighters start questioning the system simultaneously, the UFC loses the secret weapon it relied on for nearly 2 decades. Silence and information control. What happened next wasn't loud or public at first. It happened quietly in the training rooms where fighters taped their wrists before sparring sessions, in the locker rooms after brutal training sessions, in late-night texts between veterans and prospects, and in private conversations with managers who suddenly had a completely new bargaining chip in their hands. For the first time in years, the UFC was not automatically the center of every negotiation. The UFC was not the automatic choice. The UFC was not the only viable path to financial survival. And that shift, subtle at first, quickly turned into a massive groundswell. More fighters started studying Shane's interview carefully. They watched it not for entertainment value, but for actual answers. They listened to his voice carefully, looking for any signs of regret or fear, and instead found something else entirely. Relief. Genuine relief that someone from inside the system had finally said out loud what most had only dared to think private. Relief that someone had broken the spell and shown definitively that leaving the UFC didn't mean disappearing into obscurity. It could actually mean entering a completely new chapter of financial abundance. Managers began strategically using Shane Burgos' deal as a reference point in negotiations, reminding UFC executives that other organizations were now offering multi-million-dollar opportunities to talented fighters. And because the information was coming from a fighter who left respectfully, not some disgruntled former champion or recently cut veteran, the UFC couldn't easily dismiss it as noise. They weren't dealing with complaints, they were dealing with concrete evidence. Meanwhile, other major promotions gained significant confidence from watching this unfold. The PFL understood the gravity of what they had accomplished. By signing Shane, they didn't just land a talented fighter for their roster, they proved a crucial point to the entire industry. And once a promotion proves it can genuinely compete with the UFC for top talent, that promotion stops being viewed as a feeder league and starts becoming a true competitor. Even one championship in Bellator watched closely, taking careful notes on how fighters reacted to the possibility of better pay, more freedom, and improved long-term security outside the UFC's long shadow. Suddenly, fighters had real options. And options create leverage, and leverage creates pressure. That pressure began showing clearly in the UFC's behavior. They resigned certain fighters more quickly than usual. They shut down talks about free agency the moment they began. They quietly increased certain contract offers, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Dana White even shifted his public tone about competing organizations, sometimes dismissing them publicly, while negotiating far more aggressively behind closed doors. That duality, confidence on the outside, urgency on the inside, was the first clear sign that the UFC was truly feeling the heat. But the most significant indicator of genuine change came from the fighters themselves. Some began speaking cautiously in interviews about exploring their market value. Others admitted publicly that they were watching the PFL closely. A few even openly criticized the UFC's pay structure in ways that would have been completely unthinkable just a few years earlier. And all of this was underpinned by the new awareness that Shane had planted. If you are good enough, exciting enough, and willing to test the waters, there might be something significantly bigger waiting for you outside the UFC's gates. The UFC tried, as it always does, to regain control of the narrative. Dana White made calculated comments about how not every fighter can realistically be paid like a superstar. He repeated the familiar lines about how the UFC gives fighters a massive platform and exposure, but none of those lines hit as strongly as they used to. Because fighters now had a concrete example of someone who walked away from that platform and still ended up with a better financial future. That fact alone weakened every talking point the UFC traditionally used to keep its roster disciplined. And that brings us to the heart of why so many people, fans, analysts, insiders, began quietly whispering the phrase, "The UFC has finished." Not because the UFC will collapse tomorrow, not because the brand will disappear, but because the UFC's dominant grip over fighter pay, over fighter loyalty, over fighter options, is no longer absolute. The aura of invincibility has cracked. The monopoly of opportunity has been challenged. The assumption that fighters need the UFC more than the UFC needs fighters is no longer a universal truth. What truly threatens the UFC long-term is not competition. It's empowerment. It's the moment fighters realize that the risk of leaving is no longer greater than the reward of staying. Shane Burgos gave fighters something the UFC never wanted them to have: perspective. He showed that the cage door does not lock from the inside, that the UFC's bright lights are impressive, but not irreplaceable, that the title UFC fighter might be prestigious, but prestige alone does not pay for your children's future. Dana White knows this. You can hear it in his tone in the clip where he admits the company should have kept Shane. It isn't his typical dismissive posture. There's a rare vulnerability there, a recognition that the UFC might be losing control of the very system it built. When he says that losing Shane was a mistake, he's not talking about entertainment value or fan appeal. He's talking about leverage. The UFC lost a fighter who represented everything they claimed to value, and they lost him because they couldn't offer him what he deserved. And that is the true turning point. The UFC remains big, it remains powerful, it remains influential, but it no longer holds the only key. Fighters now see paths the UFC never wanted them to see. They see opportunities Dana cannot control. They see futures that aren't tied to the UFC's restrictive contracts or its unpredictable bonuses. They see that walking away doesn't mean career suicide. It can mean financial rebirth. The UFC has survived countless scandals, lawsuits, controversies, and challenges over the years. But the one threat it cannot conquer is the collective awakening of its fighters. And that awakening has genuinely begun. It started in a quiet studio with a simple interview spoken calmly by a fighter who didn't want to leave, but had no other choice. And from that moment on, the UFC was no longer the only game in town. Shane Burgos didn't just secure his own future. He changed the future of the entire sport. And Dana White, whether he admits it publicly or not, knows that the moment fighters realize their actual value, the UFC's era of unchecked dominance begins to fade. The UFC isn't finished as a company, but the idea of the UFC as the only road to greatness, that era is ended. And Shane Burgos was the first one to walk through the door that others are now lining up to follow. Like this video, click on the cards on your screen for more.